In the last section, we were able to successfully build our image and then start up our container based on it. We saw the message listening on port 8080, but when we actually tried to visit localhost 8080 inside the browser, we got a pretty nasty error message. So let's figure out what went wrong and how to fix it. All right, so here's a diagram of what's happening right now. Our browser is making a request to localhost 8080, which is essentially a reference to your current machine on port 8080. By default, no traffic that is coming into your computer or into your localhost network is routed into the container. So the container essentially has its own isolated set of ports that can receive traffic. But by default, no incoming traffic to your computer is going to be directed into the container. In order to make sure that any request from either your computer or some outside computer will be redirected into the container, we have to set up an explicit port mapping. A port mapping essentially says anytime that someone makes a request to a given port on your local network, take that request and automatically forward it to some port inside the container. So in other words, if anyone makes a request to localhost 8080, take that request, automatically forward it into the container on port 8080, where the node application can then receive it and process the request and eventually respond to it. Now, one thing that I want to make sure is really clear right now from the get-go, this is only talking about incoming requests. Your Docker container can, by default, make requests on its own behalf to the outside world. We've already seen that in action anytime that you've been installing a dependency. When we ran npm install during the Docker build process just a moment ago, npm reaches to the outside world. It reaches out across the internet. And so there's no limitation by default on your container's ability to reach out. It's strictly a limitation on the ability for incoming traffic to get into the container. So in order to set up this mapping, in order to kind of forward this traffic to a specific port inside the container, we're going to make a slight adjustment to the way in which we start the container up, or specifically the docker run command. So this is not a change that we're going to make to the Docker file. We do not set up port forwarding inside the Docker file. The port forwarding stuff is strictly a runtime constraint. In other words, it's something that we only change when we run a container or start a container up. So here's what we're going to do. To set up Docker run with port mapping, we're going to add on a -p flag. The syntax overall is Docker run, then -p. Then we're going to specify that any incoming traffic on our local network to this port right here should be automatically forwarded on to this port inside the container right here. And notice how there's a separation between these two ports, or these two numbers, of a colon. And then as usual, after that, we're going to specify either the image ID or the image name, which is what we are now using. So let's flip over to our terminal and we're going to give this a quick shot. I'm going to first stop the running container by pressing Control-C, and then I'm going to start the container back up, but this time I'm going to set up some port mapping. So I'll say anytime a request comes in to 8080 on my local machine, redirect it to port 8080 inside the container. And then I'll make sure that I still specify the image that I want to use for this container as my Docker ID. You'll put whatever yours is right there, simple web. And I'm going to get that on to just one line, like so. Okay, so let's start this. Now from the outside, it looks like everything is still identical to how it was before, but if you flip on over to your browser, open up a new tab again, and go to localhost 8080, you'll very quickly see the text "Hi there" appear on the screen. This is the response that we would expect to see from the running node application. So that means that we are now correctly forwarding incoming requests into the container. The node application is processing the request and then sending a response back out. So that's pretty much it. That is port mapping in a nutshell. Now very quickly, one last little thing that I want to show you, because this will be done very frequently on real projects. The port from the source machine or the source network that we are mapping from to the port that we are mapping to inside the container do not have to be identical. So we could very easily say, hey, anytime that a request comes into localhost 5000, redirect that request to 8080 inside the container. And like I said, this is actually something that we're going to do quite frequently in production applications. So now this is essentially saying, Okay, browser is making request to 5000, redirect request to 8080 inside the container. Again, these two ports do not have to be identical. So let's try doing that again with the docker run command. I'm going to stop the thing by pressing Control-C, and then we'll do docker run -p, and I'll say that I want to map port 5000 on my local network to 8080 inside the container. And then I'll do Stephen Greider, simple web. Okay, looks like everything started up successfully. Now if I go back over to my browser and I try to refresh localhost :8080, I'll very quickly see an error message. But if I instead go to localhost 5000, well, there's the node server. It is now taking traffic or incoming requests to localhost 5000 and redirecting them to 8080 inside the container. Now, last thing you might be kind of curious about, this is kind of an obvious, but I'm going to say simultaneously silly question. Can we change the port inside the container? Well, yes, of course. We can change this to be, 6000, 7000, whatever you want it to be. Just if you change the port inside the container, you need to make sure that your actual web server application, so inside my index.js file, we specified that our node application should listen on port 8080. So if you're going to change the target port inside the container, well, of course, you got to make sure that you change the port that your application is listening to as well. You would have to change this to 6000 or 7000 or whatever it might be. Okay, so that's it. That is port mapping in a nutshell. The one big thing to remember is that we have to specify it at runtime, not inside of the Docker file. So we've got one more step towards success. We are actually able to visit our running application inside the browser. So like I said, we were going to run into a handful of little errors along the way. We saw a case in which we were not copying over the package.json file. We saw using a bad base image, and we also saw a lack of port forwarding. Again, these are all little things that I kind of expect that you'll see as soon as you start using Docker on your own personal project. Now, even though our application is successfully running, there is one last little thing that I want to point out. So we're going to go over one last little fix in the next section. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.